أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والسلام والصلاة على خير خلقه وعلى أئمة الهدى. I want to talk a little bit in this short podcast over the fact of why I believe, in my opinion, the entire milieu and ethos of Western left-hand path Satanism is a complete joke. Not to mention that it is a inverse or reverse form of Christianity. And why brothers and sisters of colors who have chosen this particular path as their expression of the spirit, rather than being liberating themselves from the prison of white supremacy and the whole paradigm of white supremacy, have, in my humble opinion, further buried themselves and incarcerated themselves in its paradigm. Western left-hand path Satanism is essentially a colonial narrative, and a stolen colonial narrative, because the entire Western left-hand path emerges from attempts by Western occultists to basically rewrite the entire left-hand path milieu and spiritual ethos of the left-hand path, or the Vama Marga of India, which usually is translated as Kali worship. These are basically the Tantrikas, but also left-hand path would also include those who basically look at the Shakti as the Parashakti, so that the Brahma is in fact the Parashakti, meaning that the goddess is the Godhead. This is one of the early proto-tantric paths of India, which certain scholars believe is probably a leftover from the Indus Valley civilization, given some of the archaeological evidence that has come up showing that these people, the Indus Valley civilization, may have been goddess worshippers. Be that as it may, the Christianity that a lot of Western occultists reject is basically the Christianity of Europe. That is the Roman Catholic, the Protestant, and the Eastern Orthodox forms of Christianity, which in many ways, probably not the Eastern Orthodox Church, but in many ways the Catholic and the Protestant churches of Europe denuded themselves long ago of the mysteries. And those who have that kind of inclination, esoteric, mystical, otherwise, or initiatic, in my opinion, are in the right to wish to walk away from these two particular forms and pernicious forms of pseudo-spirituality and counterfeit religions, as I have always claimed them to be, both Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. The case of Eastern Orthodox Christianity is somewhat different, but as we move into the world of Orthodoxy, beyond Greek and its Russian forms, and begin to look at, for example, some of the prototypical Orthodox churches of Africa, which are the earliest of the churches, such as the Ethiopic Church and the Coptic Church of Egypt, we find that the mysteries are still intact. In fact, many of the Gnostic narratives, and particularly the Nag Hammadi codexes, etc., emerged out of the milieu of the Coptic Church of Egypt. And those who have looked upon the Ethiopic Bible, for example, find that the entire narrative of Christianity, of Ethiopic Orthodox Christianity, is very different in many chief and central elements to the Christianity that you find in Roman Catholicism or Protestantism, or even to some degree the Russian and Greek versions of Christian Orthodoxy. Nevertheless, the issue here is that Western left-hand path Satanism of the West basically takes the narrative, the goddess worship narrative, the true left-hand path of the East, of India particularly, and grafts this dualistic narrative of the war of God and Satan upon it, which, however way you'd cut it, is basically inverse or reverse Christianity, right? Yesterday in my discussion with Brother Reese on Brother Aniosaru's page, this individual, Mr. Reese, did not really address the issue to my satisfaction, and basically ran away, in my humble opinion, intellectually, in scrutinizing some of the historical elements of his own belief system. Now, within the Western occult milieus, these things are taken for granted, right? And much of it, in my opinion, also has an aesthetic element rather than a true initiatic element. So folks who gravitate towards this left-hand path, satanic, occult kind of pseudo-path, in my opinion, are basically gravitating towards it from maybe, for example, heavy metal, or some kind of a dark aesthetic appeal that this gives to them. But the initiatic elements to a lot of this stuff, in my opinion, is questionable. And its cosmology is extremely questionable, and it's because it's very dualistic, in a very, Manichaean sort of way, which is a cosmology and a metaphysics that I reject. Yes, there are elements of dualism that can tell us a lot of things about the nature of the world and the nature of ontology, etc. But a radical Manichaean cosmology or metaphysics is illogical and irrational all around. I think it would be better for a lot of these folks to go back to the original text of the left-hand path, and, for example, look at a text like the Indian Devi Mahatmyam, which is one of the proto left-hand path texts of India, where you find the Durga, the mother, the goddess, the great goddess in one of her forms, throughout this text of the Devi Mahatmyam, constantly on a rampage against the Asuras, i.e. the demons, where she, whenever she is invoked, or whenever humanity is in trouble, or her elect in particular shows up to basically kill the demons. So this narrative of the left-hand path is very different than the Satanism that these Westerners and Western folks have latched onto. But even further than that, my problem is that in people of color latching on to the LHP, even when they look at it from the point of view of black magic and sorcery, to basically gravitate towards Western Satanism is in fact a validation of the greater narrative, Western Christian narrative. Now, I would also invite these people to look into the history of the devil himself, and I would offer the argument that historically we Iranians are basically responsible for birthing the concept of the shaitan, or the devil, to world spirituality through Proto-Zoroastrianism and Zoroastrianism, the Mazda Yasna. This is the ancient religion of Iran, represented by the prophet Zarathustra. And that Zoroastrianism, in its various late antique permutations, definitely influenced and cross-pollinated with Judaism, Christianity, and eventually Islam itself. So these are things that need to be taken on board by people who are claiming to be left-hand path Satanists. I mean, I am not one of those kind of occultists that, shuns necessarily people who call themselves Satanists. I've hung out with all kinds of occultists who have, been hardcore Satanists, whether in Europe or in the United States or even here in Australia. And by and large, I look at these people as being a little bit misled initiatically, because their narratives are basically in many ways validating their form of Satanism, rather than being a rebellion against existing mores, are actually seeking to validate the existing wars and the behavior of the oligarchies and plutocrats of the time. So that this is where Guénon is actually correct about occultism, or various strands of occultism in the West, where he calls them counterfeit and counter-initiatic. Because if the current establishments and plutocracies of the West are the oppressors, then the narratives that a lot of left-hand path Satanists adopt in their so-called initiatic Satanism are actually, whether known to them or unbeknownst to them, validations of the greater narrative of the ruling classes of these societies. So these folks, rather than escaping the Christianity or the white supremacy that they've run away from, have actually found themselves back in it through a side door without realizing where they have gone. And this is why initiatic paths, real, genuine initiatic paths, are constantly warning people about false traps and false doors and all that kind of stuff. Like I said, I don't necessarily have a problem individually with individuals who associate themselves as being Western left-hand path Satanists. Because as far as I'm concerned, the true Satanists of the world are not these occult Satanists whatsoever. It is weird. The true Satanists of the world are the establishment, are the plutocrats, the plutocracies, the people responsible over the last 500 plus years in bringing this planet up to the point that we find ourselves today, on the point of a genuine global environmental Armageddon. The folks who have been responsible in the eradication of entire species of animals, plants, and bacteriology. The folks who have been responsible for the colonialism and the imperialism. The folks who spawned the transatlantic slave trade. The folks that murdered and destroyed indigenous cultures in the Americas, in Australasia, and in Africa. Those are the true Satanists. Those are the true acolytes of the Shaitan, in my book. So, those who call themselves occult Satanists, Western occult Satanists, in my opinion, are not that. So, one or two people in their 20s will have a genuine spiritual interest and then, identify themselves as that path. I put that down to their spiritual immaturity, and also the fact that the culture is cultivating identitarianism of one sort or another as a form of spiritual expression, rather than any genuine spiritual expression. And I believe as these folks, grow and put on the mileage of the years, once they get to around the age and timeline of people like myself in the early 50s, late 40s, etc., their perspective on the world will be very different. Those like the Aquinos or whatnot are on a different trajectory, to continue throughout the course of their life of identifying themselves as Satanists all the way through, in my opinion, are stuck. And my reasoning for that is that people such as Nicholas and Zena Schreck being the daughter of Anton LaVey, herself went through an enormous spiritual evolution throughout her life. And at the moment, she is very publicly an advocate for the practice of Tibetan Buddhism. So I believe, her and her husband Nicholas actually practice some form of Vajrayana Buddhism, a kind of a tantric Vajrayana form of Buddhism. Prior to this, I believe that they were practicing a form of Tantra and Kali worship. So they themselves no longer identify themselves in any kind of a meaningful way with the Western milieu of Satanism. And in fact, in the book I mentioned in the podcast yesterday, Demons of the Flesh, authored by Zena Schreck and Nicholas Schreck, if one reads, especially that book to the end, one begins to realize that they have very much moved beyond that, and they look in some ways as the current occult Satanist milieu as basically a gateway for lost souls to go through some of these initiatic societies, such as the Temple of Set, that they themselves were involved with for a long time, and perhaps find themselves out of that Western, that sort of a trap, and perhaps into genuine initiatic paths, such as Vajrayana Buddhism or the Tantras, the real practice of the Tantras, etc. Because as it stands, Western Satanism or Western occult left-hand path Satanism is an incoherent ideological mess. It doesn't hold a consistent ideology in any kind of a way that, where you can say that this group and this group and this person, this person hold a consistent ideology of Satanism. And like we said, one of the biggest problems with it is that it is a reverse or inverse form of Christianity, which more often than not, in the way that is articulated, becomes a sort of a inverse or reverse form of Christian fundamentalism, where the fundamentalism of, for example, the evangelical crowd is kind of finds itself in kind of an occultist backwash in this form of LHP Satanism. This is why I don't take this stuff seriously at all in any of its version, whether it be the Thelemic version or whether it be in its Anton LaVeyan version, or even in its Temple of Set Michael Aquino version. I think this stuff is there's just a shallowness, a metaphysical shallowness to it. Its historical consciousness and understanding about its own doctrinal content is extremely sparse. So these people don't understand what they're doing. And when we have brothers and sisters of color who are finding themselves into its milieu without, going back into some form of either a Kemetic spirituality or the spirituality of Africa itself, the pagan spirituality of Africa, however that be defined, or if you still want to practice the Abrahamic traditions, these brothers and sisters, instead of finding themselves, for example, in the Ethiopic Orthodox Church or even the Coptic Orthodox Church, are finding themselves in iterations of Western, of the white man's occultism. Now, I'm not inviting these brothers and sisters to come to Islam. If they did, I would take their shahada in a heartbeat. But the fact is that, there is a reaction by a lot of these people against what they perceive to be the authoritarianism of the Abrahamic traditions and Christianity in particular, and Christianity in its Western iteration in particular, which is without a doubt an expression of white supremacy, and it's the white man's religion that he has imposed upon black and brown folk throughout the world, and it has been the sword and it has been the spear of colonialism and imperialism for the last 500 years. However, as I would like to point out once again, because the tribes of Europe took this ideology and basically corrupted it, does not make Christianity eo ipse a corrupt ideology. And we have this once again in the evidence of these churches of North Africa and Africa itself that are much older than the official Roman Catholic Church or what have you. And I'm also not inviting these people to go back into Christianity. Nevertheless, the problem here, in my opinion, is that this Western left-hand path Satanism, whether it comes in the form, as someone like Brother Reese expresses it, or the Order of the Nine Angles, or whatever we have, is very much part and parcel of the contemporary discourse of Western colonialism and Western imperialism, whether it be across borders or even the continued colonization of the people of color within so-called conquered territory, whether we're talking about North America or whether we're talking about Europe or Australasia or whatnot. Whereas faiths such as Islam or iterations thereof, in whatever form they come, if someone converts to Islam, they don't necessarily have to become a Salafi or whatever. Islam is a pretty big tent. There is Sufism, there is Shiism, and within these two iterations. There's a massive of tendencies and whatnot. Moreover, anyone who who wishes to ventures into the world of spirituality and initiation, the first thing I would tell people is that they have to stop this transactional attitude and this consumerist attitude that the prevailing culture instills in people in shopping around for stuff. You are after the spirit. You're not after a brand. So brand shopping is the first place because it is the most counter-spiritual place that one can possibly find. But in America and under the capitalist world order and neoliberal capitalist world order, people seem to respond in a Pavlovian fashion, even in their quest to find the spirit in this form. Anyway, let me wrap this up and say that, whereas I respect a lot of these individuals who identify themselves as left-hand path Satanists, in my humble opinion, these people are misled. And if they scrutinize their own larger belief systems, they will find, to put it in Marxian terms, an immense amount of internal contradictions, not paradoxes, but contradictions to their belief system. So I will leave it there. La hujja ila aliyan qabla Muhammad.